So a jumper is a nestling martin or a fledgling age martin that is on the ground. This is not normal for a purple martin nestling or fledgling to be on the ground. I say that because there are a lot of misconceptions from some so-called experts that believe that it's okay for purple martin fledgling age young to be hopping around on the ground. That is not true. Purple martins are not like mockingbirds or bluebirds or even brown thrashers. It is not normal for them to be on the ground during their development. They leave the nest as strong flyers if they are healthy, and we will talk about that a little bit more later. So as I mentioned earlier, they can be nestlings. They leave the nest before 26 days of age, or they could be underweight or immature fledglings. Generally, the fledgling period can start at age 26 days up to anywhere to 32 days of age. That's the normal time for martins to be fledging. But in order to fledge properly, they need to be around 50 grams of weight. And we will talk a little bit more about that in a little while. So sometimes a jumper has been pushed out of the nest, and this could be accidental, bumped behind by another nestling or an adult, or it could be on purpose by a subadult that may be trying to take over the nest, and I'll discuss that some more later. And it also may be more likely to happen with certain styles of housing. So if you have a martin house, if you have shallow compartments where the entrance hole is very close to the floor, especially if the compartment size is 6 inches by 6 inches, it can be more likely to happen. If you have a shallow gourd, some of the S&K gourds tend to be shallow. If the gourd is less than 9 inches in diameter, this can be more likely to happen. Crowded housing with a lot of nestlings in it, plus a shallow compartment or a shallow gourd can lead to this happening. Or in metal or translucent housing that tends to overheat more, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. So some folks may ask, well, why did I find a baby purple martin on the ground? So some possible reasons for that happening include malnourishment, heat, mites, overcrowding, a wet nest, and subadult activity. Sometimes you'll also find young that have a physical deformity or have an injury and they are unable to fledge normally. They end up getting left behind. You may find them on the ground. So let's talk a little bit about what malnourishment means. So a malnourished martin nestling is underweight and or dehydrated. And the skin has a dry or wrinkled appearance if unfeathered. If they are feathered, sometimes if you turn them over, you can look at the abdomen and you'll see it may look kind of wrinkled and not smooth and plumped out. So you'll see in the case of this martin nestling here, the skin looks kind of dry, almost like dry winter skin on your hands. And his features are very sunken in because he's dehydrated. So a little bit more about malnourishment. You may hear, in the case of me, animal science person, or your veterinarian, or some other animal folks talk about a term called BCS. This is a body condition score. You may hear it in reference to livestock or even your cats or dogs. It also can apply to birds. So in the case of birds, you're looking at the keel bone. So the keel bone is this bone in the center of the chest here. And you're checking the keel bone to see how much it sticks out or if you can't feel it at all. So a bird that's rated a 5 would be morbidly obese, and you wouldn't even be able to feel the keel bone at all. And this would rarely happen in a martin. Usually when you have a jumper situation, it's going to be more on the range of a 2 or a 1, depending on how long they've been in a poor situation. So you may see in a 1, that bird is very close to death. They have almost no muscles on the side of that keel bone, and it feels very sharp in the top of the bone here. And a skinny bird still has a little bit of fleshing on either side of the keel bone, but you can still easily feel it, and it feels sharp. And ideal is what we're looking for here, number 3. And a healthy nestling is going to be around this point here. When they get to be fledge age, sometimes they do lose a little bit of weight, and that is normal. And I will show you on a scale later on what that looks like. So you can see in these two nestlings, this one down here does look a lot skinnier than the one up top. You can see how the keel bone is protruding even more on this nestling on the bottom, but this one is still on the skinny side as well. You may also notice that the abdomen on this martin is a little bit wrinkled too, indicating a degree of dehydration in this bird. So what is the average body weight of a healthy nestling? What should it look like? So earlier we talked about this magic number, 50. So that's a good thing to remember. And if you don't have a gram scale, it's a good thing to invest in. My avian veterinarian told me that a long time ago when I used to raise cetaceans, and I've had one ever since. It's been very useful. And a healthy martin fledgling should be right around 50 grams. So if you go to nestling age 26 days and you follow it up here, you will see that 50 grams is about that range here. And they start to drop a little bit at 30, but previous to 26 days, you'll see they actually go over 50 grams for a little while, and this is normal for them to gain weight over here, but they do lose a little bit of weight before they fledge. Again, that's normal. But if you pick up a 26-day-old martin off the ground and it's way over here, under 50 grams, and it's underweight. So this is some good useful information here from the PMCA here. Now we'll talk about mites a little bit. So mites are more common to be seen in martin housing middle to late of the season in hot weather after rain. They love humidity, they love moisture, although they can occur in dry nests as well. They're just more likely to be seen in situations where you've got a lot of moisture. Large infestations of mites can cause jumping. You may have a nestling that is otherwise healthy, but is crawling with mites and is extremely uncomfortable, and they will bail out of the nest if they get too uncomfortable. So what can you do in this situation? You can change the affected nest, especially if it's wet or heavily infested. This is definitely recommended. Anytime you have a wet nest, you should change it out if you're able to do so. And you can also treat it with 5% Sevin dust. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but there are different formulations of it coming out on the market now. Make sure you have one that has the active ingredient called carbaryl, and you don't need very much. Just about 1/4 of a teaspoon is about all you need, and that's the 5% concentration there. Just a little bit of that under the nest, and usually if your Sevin is good, in about 24 hours, those mites should be dead. Now we'll talk about heat a little bit. So if you can read those numbers on that thermometer there, you'll notice the temperature says 95. So remember that for a second here. So as I mentioned earlier, heat and malnourishment are common causes of jumping, especially this year in 2022. As we do know, much of the martin's range was affected by heat this year. It was a big, big problem. So why is that such a problem? Well, less parental feeding can occur with high temperatures. There may be less insects flying. The adults may take a break from feeding in the middle of the day. And meanwhile, those nestlings are in their compartments or gourds panting, trying to get rid of that excess heat. And when they're panting, they're losing some of that moisture in that body, and they're starting to get dehydrated. And if their feedings continue to drop off, then it's easy to see how over time they can continue to get malnourished and dehydrated from heat. So nestlings can tolerate temperatures in the mid-90s before jumping starts to be a concern. So that means the mid-90s in their compartment or in their gourd. So if the temperature inside their gourd or their compartment is over that temperature, then you could potentially have a problem before the outside ambient temperature gets that high. So that's why ventilation is a super helpful thing to add to your housing if you don't already have it there. So what can you do in those situations? You can shade the affected cavities in late nests. You can also try using ice packs. Now, the thing with ice packs, you have to be careful, and even your physician will tell you this too. You don't want to put the ice directly on your skin. So it's the same way with nestlings. Don't put it directly under them. Use a barrier. So you can put the ice pack, for example, inside a sock and then inside a plastic Ziploc bag and put it under the side of the nest so the nestlings can cuddle up to it if they want to do so. Another way to handle that is to put it into a neighboring compartment on the neighboring wall. That's one way you can lower temperatures. Let's see. Another way you can handle temperatures there is to insulate the walls or the roof of housing. You can do that using sometimes scrap materials you may have around the house. You can use styrofoam board, you can use corrugated plastic signboard. I have a relative who volunteers for local elections, and he often has extra signboard from those races, and he's given me a whole bunch of those signs. So I have that supply to use if I need it for anything, and it can be used as a shade if you need it to be. So how can you help prevent problems from heat? As I mentioned earlier, it's a good idea to install ventilation. So if you have houses with compartments, you can put vents on the sides of those houses. Some houses, like trios, have a little bit of ventilation in them already. I'll point that out in a later slide. You can also install ventilation elbows into gourds. And if you live in the Southeast or in the South or even in the Midwest, it's highly recommended that you ventilate your housing. And that's a good thing to do in the off season. Another thing you can do is enlarge house compartments. So as I mentioned earlier, try to avoid 6x6. If you can enlarge it to 6x12, that's healthier for the martins for two reasons. One, a martin is 7.5 inches long on average. So you can see how quickly a 6x6 compartment could cause overcrowding and overheating in a bunch of warm nestlings. And two, when martin nestlings get hot, they tend to spread out away from each other and pant. And if they're in a larger compartment or in a larger gourd, it's easier for them to spread out away from each other and give each other space to breathe. Another thing is you can make sure you are using large gourds. That means a gourd at least 9 inches in diameter. Try to stay away from the smaller gourds. Use opaque housing. Try to stay away from thin-walled housing or thin-walled gourds. You don't want the walls of your housing to be translucent. And if you have a metal house, you can either install more ventilation in it or add more insulation to it, or do both of those things to help cut down on the heat for the house. Another thing you can do is paint the housing white. There's a lot of beautiful decorative martin houses that you can build or buy, and many of them are not painted white or do not have white roofs. They may have a dark roof. And this can not really help. This actually hurts the situation and makes it even harder for those nestlings to stay cool if that housing is then getting even hotter from having a dark roof. So paint that housing white. It may not be as cute if it doesn't match your house, but it's a good thing to do what's right for the martins and keep them cooler. Paint it white. Don't use thin plastic housing. I mentioned that earlier. You want opaque housing. You don't want translucent housing. You don't want the light to come through. It creates a greenhouse effect on those babies. If you have metal housing, consider insulating it. I mentioned earlier you can use styrofoam board, or even sheets of wood as an off-season project if you want to do that. So housing commonly affected by heat issues. These are some of the examples I mentioned earlier, and this might help give you a visual if you don't know what housing you have and recognize one of these pictures. So here on the left, we have an S&K barn, and this is an S&K red barn. These two are very common on the martin house market right now. And you can right away see several problems with these. One is the dark roof. These are thin plastic, they have a dark roof, and that's going to get pretty hot in the sun. The next thing that's a problem with this particular model for both of these is you see that they have these attic rooms, and it was built to increase the capacity of these houses, but they're impossible to check, and they get very hot in these spaces, again, from the dark roof and the lack of ventilation up here. And there have been many cases that we have read about and heard about of martin nestlings dying in these upper houses. So if you have a house like this, we recommend that you A, paint it white, and B, close off these upper rooms and these attics so the martin nestlings don't have to overheat in these rooms here. So small gourds, that's another issue with overcrowding, and thin walled gourds like this plastic one here. I believe this is a Heath model. You can see how small this gourd is, 6 3/4 inches in diameter. And how big is the average martin? 7.5 inches. That's one adult. And when the fledglings come out of their nest, they're almost about the same size as the adults. So you can see how quickly that will be crowded and create unhealthy conditions to use a gourd like this, and we don't recommend that. Metal housing, this is a trio here. And the trio does have some ventilation holes here on the top. So it's not, as bad as example as these attic rooms would be. But this is thin metal and it can overheat in hot climates. So you could consider adding some shade panels to the roof here and painting the roof white on these two to help reflect the sun a bit better. This is a Heath metal plastic house. It has some of the same issues that the S&K houses have. I don't know if this particular model can even be open for nest checks. That's another thing to consider is if you buy the cheaper houses with the thin walls, if it's almost impossible to get them open for nest checks, it's going to make it hard to get a jumper back to where he needs to be. However, if it's really hot outside, the heat issues can affect any housing, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So shading and cooling, as I mentioned earlier, you can use a sign board, like plastic sign board, as a way to provide shade. So in this case, this person here is using the sign board as a shade over these chore horizontal gourds to assist with these late nests. And you can see this in this photo, these nestlings or the parents here are sitting here enjoying the shade under this panel. Ventilation, as I said earlier, is recommended in all the hot areas of the martins range. It seems like just about everywhere was hot this year. Anyway, as an off-season project, if you have not done this already to your gourds, it's highly recommended to add ventilation to them. Here's an example of a ventilation elbow here being put into a super gourd. Some more examples of shading here. So this is a Lone Star house. I believe this is the Goliad model. And this house is generally well built and well insulated. It does have wood insulation in the roof under the metal, which is a bit of a upgrade from the trio, and some more ventilation holes here. But it can also suffer an intense heat like they've had in Texas and other parts of the country this year. So this person here added some shading panels to the roof and secured them with bungee ties here. And nothing you'll notice here about the shade panels is there's a gap between the panels and the roof to allow for airflow here between the sign board and the roof. And that's important if you add panels there, and see she's got some little blocks of wood to create a gap here between the areas of the roof. She did tell me that if she were to improve this particular shade panel setup that she had, that she would recommend making these actually a little bit longer. They have more of an overhang to shade more of the front porch and a little bit more on the sides as well. Misting. You'll see some people talk about using misting to cool via evaporative cooling for their martin housing. And I urge you to use those with caution. If you're in an area that is super steamy with high humidity and high dew points, it may not help much, especially if the water can't evaporate because the atmosphere is already saturated. One thing you want to be careful about is not allowing the mist to enter cavities. That would equal wet nest, and that could also increase the growth of mites. However, some people have reported that the adults really enjoy flying through mist that they set up. It may help cool off the adults. So you have to think about it in terms of your local area and your local weather conditions, if this is a good choice for you to use or not. In the picture on the bottom left, you can see that how misting can possibly make a difference. And this was a temperature in a gourd before misting and then after, where evaporative cooling was allowed to cool the inside of the gourd. You can see that it did make a difference. But again, that evaporative cooling only helps if the humidity isn't so high that the water can actually evaporate and cool off the surface. So a few more creative ideas here. So this person here got some straw hats and cut them to fit her Troyer gourds. So you can see the tunnel here is just poking out of the edge of the hat. And the interesting thing about these hats is it's actually high enough over the top to go over the top of the Troyer gourd and cover the high part where it hooks into the gourd rack itself. So I thought this was kind of creative. And then there's a little tie here at the bottom to try to secure the hat in place. And then she also tried misting as well. So what should you do if you find a jumper? So first priority is to get it off the ground and into a safe shaded area. There's a lot of bad information going out there around the web also, like I mentioned earlier, about it being normal or not normal for marten fledglings to be on the ground. It is not normal. Parents will not feed on the ground. Again, this is not a bluebird. This is not a mockingbird. This is not a brown thrasher. It is a purple marten. They will not feed it on the ground. So you need to get it off the ground and into a safe shaded area. You need to try to determine which cavity it came from. That is a lot easier if you have been doing regular nest checks through the season, so you have your records to refer to, and you know if a nestling is missing from a particular cavity. So then you need to try to determine why it jumped and remedy the situation. Was it from heat? Was that nestling thin? You check the keel bone. Is that nestling covered with mites? Is your housing covered with mites? Are you having a problem with subadults trying to claim housing? Is it a crowded gourd? Did it get jostled out? Et cetera, et cetera. You want to put it back into its own nest if possible. So I'm going to reiterate that a little bit. What are your priorities if you find a jumper? You want to put it back in its own nest. Depending on the age of that nestling, you may need to plug the gourd or the house cavity after you put it in. A jumping age for a normal marten nestling that's healthy is anytime on or after age 22 days. So if you know that marten nestling is older than that, you will probably need to use a plug and string method to keep that cavity closed after you put the marten nestling back in to keep it from jumping out again immediately and feeling disturbed. If you can't put it back in its own nest for whatever reason, if the housing was destroyed or the parents are gone, try to put it into a foster nest. Again, the priority is for it to be raised by martens, either by number 1 or by number 2. If there are no foster nests, and if you cannot put it back in its own nest, number 3 is to place it with a licensed rehabber. If you cannot do any of those 3 things, then the last thing you should try is whatever you can do to help, but that is only if other options are absolutely not possible. So fostering within your own colony, how do you know where to put it if you can't put it back in its own nest? So you want to place that nestling or that fledgling in with other like-sized, healthy nestlings. So I've mentioned earlier how to determine if those nestlings are healthy, for instance, if they're emaciated or dehydrated, or if they look well-fleshed and look alert. You don't want to overload the nest. So you don't want more than 5 nestlings total per nest if possible. And you want to make sure that both foster parents are present and feeding the young, not only the male or not only the female. And if there are only subadult nests available for fostering, then you may want to restrict the number even more. And if you have multiple foster nests available and they're all subadults, you may consider, if you need to foster more than one, spreading those out among multiple foster nests, because generally speaking, subadult parents may not be as good at feeding as adults are. But what if you don't have any foster nests available at your own colony? How can you find an outside foster nest? So this often requires getting outside your own backyard, and I've talked about this a lot if you've ever talked to me about networking with other marten landlords and setting up public sites, etc. So I think it's important to not just focus on your martens in your yard, but to think about our martens as a population and as a conservation movement. So network, if you can, with other marten landlords near you. If you're driven down the road and you see that guy with a gourd rack 1 mile down the road, stop by and say hi one day. Who knows, you may need his help, or he may need your help one day. Or join a group, a forum, a club, a society, or any other organization to find help when you need it. And if you're here tonight, then you've already started that process, and we're happy to have you. So a little bit about management and jumpers. They are connected. So as I mentioned earlier, regular nest checks can lead to better management, in that you can determine the age of those nestlings during your nest checks and where that nestling belongs. If you go to a gourd 1 week, it's got 5 nestlings, and then you see a jumper, and that day that gourd has 4 nestlings, you know possibly where that nestling came from, and you can determine that fairly quickly by keeping accurate records and doing nest checks. Another benefit to doing regular nest checks is the nestlings get used to being checked and are calmer if you need to lower housing later. We've talked to people who have said, oh no, I can't put the jumper back because if I lower the housing, then all the rest of them are going to jump. I just didn't want to bother them. But if you've been doing regular nest checks all along and you're familiar with the plug and string method, then there's a good chance that they will be calmer than you think they may be, and you can get them in there and put them back. So also with good management and regular nest checks, you can stay on top of problems and fix them to help prevent jumpers. So that includes wet nests or mites, etc. Another thing I mentioned earlier is it's important to use housing that can easily be managed because that makes it easier to deal with jumpers. I've talked to several people this season that have housing that either can't be raised or lowered, or they have housing that can't be opened easily. So A, they have no idea where the jumper came from, or B, they aren't able to get up to the nest to return that nestling to the proper nest. So this is something to think about in the off season. If you can modify your housing to make it easier to manage or invest in equipment that will help make it easier to manage or even replace it entirely with something that can be used on a winch and cable or open pulley system, that will make it easier to deal with jumpers if you have to in the future. Also, if you have a problem with subadults, these are extra young, we call them problem teenager boys, come into your colony and trying to take over nests and throwing out young nestlings or bullying nestlings and pushing them out of nests, you can consider putting up extra housing for them. And that can be something in the middle of the season. I call it a distraction gourd. If you need to hang up an extra gourd under your gourd rack or put up a temporary rack with just a couple of gourds on it, just somewhere that those subadults can call their own territory so that they'll be possibly more likely to leave your nestlings alone. That's a consideration. How to find a licensed rehabber. So I saw a post earlier today on another group where this person needed a rehabber. So he said, I need a rehabber, and he put his phone number on the page. Well, the thing about licensed rehabbers is they're not going to call you. You have to find them. And oftentimes it can be difficult to find them. So you can start by calling your state's Wildlife Resources Commission or check their website, the commission's website, and often they have links on there for their rehabbers. You can contact your local veterinarians or rescue groups. Often the veterinarians will know who their local rehabbers are. In my particular state of North Carolina, there's a whole lot more small mammal rehabbers than there are songbird rehabbers. And there's some rehabbers that specialize in songbirds or raptors or small mammals, one or the other. So you have to make sure that the particular rehabber that you're calling does work with songbirds, because that's what a martin is classified as a songbird. You can check with wildlife clubs or groups near you. They may have some connections for you. And try to find a rehabber with experience with purple martins. Some do not have any, and you'll figure that out pretty quickly by talking with them if they understand what a martin is. If, for example, they tell you, put that baby back on the ground, you found it on the ground, put it back on the ground, they clearly don't know much about martins. That could be a red flag for you. Or if they don't understand that the nestling is underweight and you've told them how much it weighs, that could be another red flag. Just a few examples there. So ask them if they've worked with martins. And ask if the rehabber can release it back with your colony if possible. And if this isn't possible, if your colony has left, then another local colony where that nestling or fledgling can be with other martins is a good way to go, or a local roost site as kind of a last-ditch effort. So the important thing here to remember is to try to find a rehabber before you actually need one. And they can be a lot happier to help you if you consider donating towards their rehab expenses too, because they are nonprofits. Sometimes out-of-state rehabbers will work with you if needed for advice. There are a couple of them floating around. I think there's 1 or 2 in Texas. And I talked to one in Virginia not too long ago as well. So sometimes you'll get lucky and some of those folks will help you, or they will be willing to talk to your local rehabber to tell your local rehabber what they need to do to help your martins. So what if you've gone through all those things and you can't find a rehabber? One thing you need to remember is that short-term feeding for a grounded marten nestling is a huge commitment, and it should only be done if there is absolutely no other choice. Licensed rehabbers have the federal permits and the flights required to house native migratory songbirds for eventual release. The key of that sentence is eventual release. And releasing the jumper as a healthy fledgling is always the end goal. You have to remember, this is not a pet, and that is the spirit of the law. Okay, so you understand that? Now what do you do? Now, short-term feeding and care, remember, there's a few key things here to keep in mind with martens. Remember that the temperature of your house might be a whole lot cooler than what they just came out of. And if you quickly plunge them into the AC of your house, it may send them into shock. So if you can keep them in a garage or a shop where the air temperature there is cooler than the outside temperatures, but maybe not as cold as your house, then that's a better choice. Do not give them water directly by mouth, because that's a big risk of aspiration. If you don't know what that word means, it's a fancy word for choking. Their opening to their windpipe is right there near their tongue and their mouth, and it's very easy to accidentally get water in their windpipe, so don't ever give them water directly by mouth. They get all the moisture they need from their diet normally, if they are healthy, or in the case of feeding, from Pedialyte dipped insects. Now, if you pull it out, you don't want to immediately try to feed it, especially if it has been very hot. If the reason for jumping was heat, you need to wait an hour or two for that jumper to recover and settle down before attempting to feed. And sometimes that nestling will perk up considerably after it is no longer overheated. And when you do feed, use blunt edge tweezers for safety, not the sharp slant edge ones. So what to feed? So some pictures here on the right. Some things to use include crickets, superworms or Zophobus, mealworms, BSF or black soldier fly larvae. I don't have a picture of those, but just imagine a shorter, bulkier version of a mealworm. Beef heart. And these things you can feed fresh or frozen, then thawed. Dip it in Pedialyte before feeding it, and the Pedialyte in combination with the insect that's either fresh or frozen will give the moisture that is needed to the nestling. Do not use freeze-dried insects or dehydrated insects. Why? Because they're dehydrated. They don't have the moisture in them anymore, and the nutrition on them is not the same. Another thing you can use is scrambled eggs prepared without oil. Martens cannot tolerate oil in their diet or fats in their diet, so don't use oil. Another thing you can use, and the thing that many rehabbers use, is a type of cat food called Science Diet Light. And to use it properly, it has to be soaked overnight in cold water, and it can be a long, laborious, tough process to do that. And if any of y'all are interested in that process, I could send you the directions, but it's too long for a slide. So just let us know later on if you're interested in that, and we can get that information to you. So what if you can't find any Pedialyte at the store, or you want to make your own? So this is a homemade recipe for Pedialyte straight from a rehabber. Penny Halstead had a lot of experience with purple martens. And this is the recipe for that. 1 teaspoon salt, 3 teaspoons sugar, 1 quart warm water. Mix that together and store it in the fridge. Now we're going to go to a video by our own Kathy Fries here, and she's going to show us some nice feeding techniques. So I'm going to have to close out this screen and go to an external file. So just hang on one second while I get that pulled up.
So this is how I feed. This is one of the nestlings that he's about 26 or 27 days old. So I make sure that they have their little feet on my fingers under here so they feel comfortable and secure. And I have these 2 fingers that I put on either side of his beak. And then I use this finger with a fingernail to pry his beak open, like that. And then I hold it with those 2 fingers. I get a cricket. And I like to grab them by the tail, like this. Hopefully you can see that. And then I put it on top of the tongue, and I push back just a little bit. And he says he doesn't want the leg, so. And then they just take it down. For new purple martin nestlings that are first-time feeders, unlike this guy, he's been feeding for 4 or 5 days now. You may have to push it back in there a little bit until you feel it give just a little bit, and they'll go down. They'll take it down their throat. So again, take these 2 fingers, your thumb and your pointer finger, put it on either side of the beak, and by the way, that's to keep it from going from side to side. Open the beak with the fingernail, hold it open with those 2 fingers, get a cricket. And by the way, if you try to slide it down the side of their mouth like that, in the side of either cheek, I like this one because it's closest to me, they'll swallow it much easier. So one more time. Fingers on both sides, pry the beak open, get a cricket, shove it in, and they'll take it down. And by the way, my crickets are all dipped in Pedialyte or soaking in Pedialyte, so that he gets his moisture from that as well.
All right, we've now entered into the Q&A part of our presentation. And I think Brad and Kathy may have a few comments about it before we open the floor to questions. Either one of y'all feel like talking first?
I'll go, Brad, if you don't mind. All right, so that particular nestling that you just saw had, like I said, had been feeding for 4 or 5 days already. He didn't start out that way though. He was very resistant when I first picked him up off the ground. And normally if they're very resistant, they'll clamp their beak shut. And if it's too hard to pry that beak open, I don't force it. I usually wait until the next day because I figure by the next day, he's going to be pretty hungry and maybe a little more cooperative. Some of the other nestlings that I had with him, they, you know, every nestling is different. Every nestling has a different personality. And some of them I actually got started because they were squawking at me when I picked them up. And when I brought them in, I put them in a 5-gallon bucket. And then I would go get my crickets or whatever later, an hour or two later, like Courtney said, let them cool off first. And when they started squawking at me, as soon as they opened their mouth to squawk at me, I would shove the mealworm or a cricket into their mouth. And they'd be like, you know, hey, that's pretty good. So, and then they would take it down. And after that, they would become easier to feed. But they're all different. You just, you know, if they're squawking, shove a, he's a movie star now. Yeah, he is. That particular nestling actually got tired of me feeding him forcefully with my fingers around his beak. And he started gaping for me the very next day. I never took any video, but he actually started gaping and took it very easily on his own. But anyway, the point is every nestling is different. So you just have to work with them and see how they will take food and give it to them the most comfortable way. 2 other points I would like to make. And I have made this mistake and I've been feeding for years and I still make it. But it's important when you have these nestlings to put them in a 5-gallon deep bucket with nesting material on the bottom. Number 1, so they don't get splayed leg. But number 2, also so that they can't fly out and get away from you and you have to go chase them down in the yard again, hopefully before a hawk grabs them. But I keep them all in a 5-gallon bucket with nest material in the bottom. And I don't give them perches or anything like that, because if you think about it, that's the way they're in the gourds, right? Naturally anyway, right? They're sitting in these gourds. And if you put them up on perches and you leave them sit on your porch outside in the heat or whatever, you lose everything that you gain by rehydrating them with Pedialyte and feeding them, because they're using energy to stay on the perch, and they're losing any hydration that you give them if they're sitting out in the heat. So make sure you put them in a 5-gallon bucket. Don't put them on a perch, put them in the bottom of the bucket. And I have actually had nestlings that were ready to go, and I would forget and go to clean their bucket out, and I'd put them in a smaller bucket, and away one would fly, which was great. He was ready to go, but I wasn't ready for him to go. I wanted to make sure that I released him at an appropriate time when all of the rest of the colony was there to watch him be released. So I think those are all the points I wanted to cover, Courtney. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kathy.
Mhm.
All right, Mr. Brad.
I have nothing to say.
Yes, you do.
The only thing I can add to what Kathy said is I typically try to release any jumpers in the mornings while the adults are still sitting on the racks. And you'll know that you did a really good job with it if martins bail off the gourd racks and go after the fledgling or the jumper. You definitely don't want to do it during the middle of the day when all the adults are just concentrating on making feeding trips. Mornings are best. Really, the only thing that I was going to add to the presentation, whoops, where'd y'all go? Can y'all still hear me? Yeah, there you go. I was trying to swipe a fly and I made
Another fly.
my Zoom go away. You've all at least heard about using 7 dust in a martin nest for mite control. Well, that we're going to have to stop using the term 7. 7 is a brand name. They only have one product now that has carbaryl as the active ingredient. And it's the 1-pound shaker cans. But to add confusion to that, they also sell a 1-pound shaker can that the active ingredient is not carbaryl. Give you a backstory on carbaryl. I worked in the commercial poultry industry for 19 years, and I said it myself, carbaryl used to carry FDA approval for use directly on poultry that was meant for human consumption, meaning you could open the bag, pour it on the chicken, and it was okay. It's considered practically non-toxic. That is an actual category that the FDA uses for birds. I've taken it out, poured it in the floor of chicken houses with chickens in it, used a leaf blower to blow it around to kill mites. It no longer carries that label. It's not because the FDA suddenly decided that it was dangerous. It's because it costs money to, you can get anything labeled basically for anything you want as long as you pay the FDA enough money. And they weren't making enough money with carbaryl selling it to the poultry industry to maintain that label. So it does not have to say 7 on the container as long as it says carbaryl. You can still buy carbaryl labeled as carbaryl online. You can buy little containers of 5% dust. It doesn't say 7 on it, but that's perfectly okay. What you're after is the active ingredient. I'm not big on hoarding a lot of anything. Well, there's a few things I hoard, but anyway, it might be wise for all of us martin people to stock up on carbaryl now. As long as you keep it in a cool, dry, dark place, it will last a long time. I have heard that it's being taken off the market. I've heard that it's not being imported now because of, the problems we've had with importing and exporting everything. It's primarily made in China. So, what's true, I don't know. I've been told both stories by people who are in the chemical industry that should know. One of them says it was an import issue. The other one says they were stopping making it. Either one of them should know the right answer. So who knows what the correct answer is. But once carbaryl is gone, we are much more limited in things that we can use that are safe for birds. You do not want to use the wrong chemical in the nest. The chemical that they replaced in the 1 pound shaker bottle, I can't remember the chemical name, but it's not nearly as bird friendly as carbaryl. So you definitely do not want to use it. I've seen a lot of posts this year about that, and several people have used the wrong stuff.
Brad, is it perithrin?
No, it's not. I'm not going to say it's not a in the permethrin class, but it is not. It's like imicloprid, or it's a weird name.
Okay.
Which most names like that are, but the only other safe chemical that we can use in a purple martin nest is a pyrethrin, not permethrin, pyrethrin. That's the stuff made from chrysanthemum flowers. Now, that's where it originated. Now it's synthetically made like everything else, but it is one level more toxic to birds than carbaryl. It is still considered safe, but it is not as safe as carbaryl. For people in Canada, people that deal with blowflies, that flies off stuff that you've heard of, I'm sure Kathy and Courtney, that people use for buffalo gnats and blowflies, that is a pyrethrin. So it can be used, but as I said earlier, it's not as non-toxic as carbaryl. So it's dealing with mites in the next decade may end up getting to be a problem, but we got to do something, or well, all our birds will be jumpers. So, but that's all I have.
All right, great. Thanks, Brad. Does anybody have any questions or comments? If you do, feel free to unmute yourself or post it in the chat if you're having trouble with your microphone.
Okay, I've already unmuted myself because I have a question. This is Terry. I've had a situation the last couple of days where we had 1 or 2 little martin people that bailed out early that we had to rescue on the ground, and been through the feeding them crickets and did okay with that. My question to you guys, once you get one that accepts that many big crickets, and how do you determine when it's time for it to go, and how do you let it go? Is it put it back as close as you can to the roost? Do you give it a launch? What do you do with those to see when they're ready to rejoin the other birds?
I will tell you what I do. Like Brad though, I wait until morning when all the other martins are hanging around. Okay. And I usually, excuse me, I am trying something new this year, and it seems to be working really well. I have a spare gourd that I take out and I put that jumper in it, and I put it away from the main colony on one of my other poles. I have a feeding tray pole where I have oyster shells and things like that. I put that gourd up there. First I let everybody see that I'm carrying a nestling martin out, and that kind of gets the colony excited anyway, and they start flying around. I put him in the gourd, I plug the gourd, I put it back up, and then I wait 5 or 10 minutes and I pull that plug out. And this year, it's the first time I've tried that, and I gotta tell you, it's working really well, because the subadult males have been going over to that gourd where I have that jumper nestling that I'm ready to release and calling him out. And it, I did one just last week two of them actually in the same gourd. And it was only about 30 minutes, and both of those martins were off and flying. Now I had to sit out there and watch to make sure they didn't land on the ground again. But that subadult male got one of them out and took off within 15 minutes. And the second one came out about 20 minutes later or so and took off with the same subadult male. But there were, well, as a matter of fact, I had a female that started feeding the second one. I don't know if she had lost her nest, but that was an unusual case, I'm sure, where she started feeding the second nestling. I'd never seen that before. But the point is, take them out when all the other martins are there. And I have also released them from my, I have a porch with a railing that's about 14 feet off the ground. I have also put them on top of that railing and let them sit there and chirp to the rest of the colony and get the colony's attention. And then I just let them go. Take my hands off of them, I should say. I don't ever push or launch one into the air. I've just been told to never do that, so I don't. But anyway, and usually if they're ready to go, they'll take off from that 14-foot railing. And if not, they land on the ground. So I give them another day or two before I try again.
Okay.
Those are just the things that have worked for me, Brad and Courtney.
That I like your idea about the gourd, Kathy. That's a really good idea. I'll use that from now on. Terry, just so you know, I'm blessed with fence posts being a farm boy, so I just usually sit mine on top of a fence post, and they'll sit there from 10 seconds to 30 minutes, but they usually take off from there. I will tell you this, however, I have given some the toss, and after doing that and paying attention to what happened, I don't watch the jumper fly away. I watch how the adults react to the jumper when it flies away. Most times, the nestlings that I have tossed up into the air have not been pursued by adults. And I can't say this for sure, but in my mind, if they're not pursued by adults, then they're probably not going to make it. They're going to land in a tree. They're not going to have any encouragement to come out. For those of you who have watched martins fledge, watched nestlings fledge, it's almost without fail that you have 5 to 7 to 10 adults, whether SYs or ASYs, will pursue the nestling that just fledged, and they will bump them on the sides. They will fly up under them and bump them. They will fly on top and bump them. And I don't know if they're trying to teach them evasive maneuvers for hawks. I don't know if they're trying to just strengthen their flight muscles by making them try harder, but that's very common. So when I don't see that, it worries me. So I won't ever give any more a toss up into the air, because I don't think that's a good method.
So Kathy, I just thought of something else. I don't know if I covered this or not, but can you talk briefly, either you or Brad, talk briefly about how much you're giving them per feeding, and then to reiterate the proper weight for a fledgling before it's released?
Sure. So I used to just give them 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 crickets every 2 hours. But it sure takes a long time to get them up to weight. And I thought, I'm going to try this. So I started giving them more. And of course, these are older fledglings we're talking about. The younger fledglings can't take as much. But if you're talking about a nestling that's 25, 26 days old, or in that range, 23, 24, I can usually get anywhere from 5 to 7 crickets down a nestling. If I'm using superworms, which I prefer to use superworms, also sometimes called Zophobas, I can get 5 to 6 of those down them. Usually they let me know when they're full by spitting whatever the last one is back out at me. And by the way, if you're using Zophobas or superworms or even mealworms, and they're alive, you need to crush the heads on them because they can bite into the cheek of the nestling and hang on before you can get it down. So either crush the head, or this year I started freezing my sophobas, and I found they were so much easier to feed because they're not wiggling and trying to curve their way out of the mouth or whatever.
Trying to fight back.
Yeah, trying to fight back. So this year I froze them and it worked much easier. But anyway, I can get, you know, and usually I'll start them out with about 3 Zophobas and see how they do with that. But I'll usually move them up as they get older to 5 or 6 Zophobas. And by the way, that's every 2 hours. Sometimes I'll feed them more often if they eat less. Say if one only took 3 Zophobas, I'll go back in an hour and give him another 2. Because remember, parents are constantly feeding out there in the gourds and feeding every 15 to 20 minutes. Not the same nestling, obviously, but the same nestling could get fed as much as 30, 45 to an hour minute, you know. So I have gotten to where I just stuff them as full as I can. And you can fill their bellies underneath. You can feel the food move down their throat, and you can feel their belly start to extend. And so you'll know when they're full. They'll let you know when they've had enough. They will literally spit it back at you. I have worn crickets in my hair back inside the house, so they let you know. And by the way, the best release weight is 50 grams. And that's not just because of the weight. It's also because of the muscle that they're putting on, muscle around their breastbone that helps them flap their wings. I want to go back to one other thing I mentioned earlier about putting the spare gourd with the jumper nestling on a separate feeder pole that I have. If you don't have a separate feeder pole, another thing you can do is take that gourd and put a rope through the top of it and put fashion a hook like out of a coat hanger wire or something thicker. I use something thicker, but I don't know what it's called. It's maybe number 10 gauge, Brad. I don't know. I'll find out.
That sounds good. 10 gauge wire is pretty.
10 gauge is pretty thick. Okay. And I make a long hook out of it, and I will actually get on a ladder and hook that up on an existing gourd rack also, so that gourd hangs down lower than the rest of my gourds, but he's sitting right there in the middle of the colony where all the other parents are feeding the other nestlings, and they will notice him because he will eventually stick his head out and say, "Hey, I missed you guys, but I'm back. Can you help me out here a little bit?" You know, so you can also do that and as an idea just to add that gourd into your main rack as well. But that's how much I feed.
Another good thing about your gourd is I think that the resident martins are going to be inquisitive because they know that that's a new gourd, and so they're going to naturally want to check it out anyway, and they're going to find out there's a nestling in there. That's a great idea.
Thank you.
You're so smart.
Desperation.
there's another thing that I would like to talk about. It's not all cheery. It's not cheerful. It's not happy. It's not fun, but it does happen. Sometimes your jumpers, when you find a nestling on the ground, sometimes that nestling is there because the parents stopped feeding it for a reason. They can have a genetic abnormality. They can have a defect of some sort that you may not can see. But you need to know before you start that not every nestling that you feed is going to survive. I have had the closest rehabber to me is a 2-hour drive away, and I have to drive through Birmingham, Alabama, which is kind of like Atlanta, Georgia, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Minneapolis, or it's a big town with horrible traffic, and I don't like it. So, and I can't drive 2 hours every other day when I have a jumper to take to them. I've been feeding jumpers for a long time, and I've always had pretty good success with raising them to maturity. I think the world's ending. Something really loud just went boom behind my head. So if y'all see like troops coming across the hill, please let me know so I can go grab the appropriate something. But anyway, back to my stop rambling, Brad. You're gonna lose some. I had 5 jumpers this year. That's all I had. My birds, I fledged about 60 nests, the hottest week we've had this year, and I had 5 jumpers. All 5 of them died. I fed, I did as much as I could. I gave them hydrated crickets, hydrated superworms, but they were so far gone when I got to them. The scale that Courtney showed earlier with a slide, they would have all scored A1 on that scale. But you know, I've never lost half of what I've tried to save, but this year I lost them all. So, you know, if you can't handle that, find a rehabber, because it is a very real possibility.
And it is a big commitment. It's a lot of work. You have to spend time prepping their food. You have to make sure that, you know, you feed them correctly, and you make sure you clean out their nests like mom would. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, a lot of us still work, and I'm fortunate that I own a business. So I just take my little purple Martins with me. I put them on my desk. Somebody, you know, says something smart, I threaten to fire them. I feed my Martins. I bring them home. So I don't, you know, I can feed them as often as they need to be fed, is my point. But if you're going to work, if you still work an 8 to 10 hour day job, and you're going to be gone for 8 to 10 hours, there's no way you're going to raise a jumper. They can't recover from what they've been through if they're only going to get fed 2 or 3 times a day. It's just not going to happen.
Looks like we have some raised hands, Debbie.
Yes, I've got a question and a comment. You helped me earlier this year. You know, I had some jumpers, and Kathy was a really big help. But my comment is on the Pedialyte. I'm just always looking for ways to remember stuff easily and not have to look it up. And even when Kathy was helping me out, she couldn't remember the recipe. But when I looked it up, it's a teaspoon of salt, 3 teaspoons of sugar, and a quart of water. Well, I don't know why they say 3 teaspoons, because 3 teaspoons is a tablespoon. So it's real easy to remember: a teaspoon of salt, a tablespoon of sugar, and a quart of water.
Good point, Debbie.
I never had to look up the recipe again. Once I saw that, I'm always tweaking recipes though. I guess that just comes from cooking for nearly 50 years. But my question was on when I was feeding mine, they very seldom spit them out, but I would put one in their mouth and they would get it about a little ways down, or, you know, and then it would just stay there. They wouldn't swallow. So I just put them back in the nest then, and sometimes I'd go back and they would be spitted out. Sometimes I'd go back and they would be swallowed it. But that was kind of how I told when they got full. I just fed mine until they quit eating. So, but leaving one in the throat like that, that's okay. That's not a problem.
No.
Okay.
One way I would get them to move it on down, if I thought they hadn't had enough yet, this is a good point, Debbie, is if they haven't taken it all the way down yet and they close their beak, I would take another cricket, dip it in the Pedialyte, and drop a drop of water on the top of their beak. Mm-hmm. And what the water would do is go down in the crease of their beak, and then they would lick the water, and they would swallow. That's one way to trigger the swallow reflex, is to just drip just one drop right on the tip of their beak.
Yeah, I worried about them choking, but they didn't. I didn't think I needed to reach down in there and pull the cricket back out.
No, you've seen the videos with the huge dragonflies that the parents are feeding them,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, it's
You can also rub them under the beak on the
that's
soft part of the mouth, not the beak itself, and that will stimulate their swallowing reflex too.
that's a good point. Thank you, Brad.
I don't know if mine made it or not. I assume they did because I put them back in the gourd and I never found another one on the ground. Well, I did find one on the ground, I guess, but I don't think it was one of those because it was several days later. And but anyway,
Okay.
some of them they may not have. I have no idea because I was not able to actually be out there and see any of them when they fledged.
Understood. Yeah.
So, but anyway, I'm hopeful. I'm trying to think positive.
You have
There you
to.
go.
Thanks.
All right,
Dave.
all right,
Travis.
Travis.
You have a hand up?
All right, yeah. So we're trying to watch ours come in. We still have a few coming in. So question is, and first of all, thank you guys for this amazing presentation. That was very well put together. Didn't know about the keel bone, although I've looked at it from a hunter's perspective and trying to judge birds and stuff, but the whole presentation was great. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So question is, as somewhat of still of a newbie, because we haven't dealt with many jumpers, when you get a jumper and we want to calm our minds down, don't want to panic, what would be the first, second, or third things you do? Is it weighing the bird, trying to look inside the nest if they have fledglings? What would you do if we slow our minds down? What should people do, or newbies like us, or asking a friend if you have a jumper?
Put it back, put it back, put it back, put it back, call the rehabber, try to feed it.
Okay. So I agree, Brad, put it back. But just I always have a 5-gallon bucket prepared with fresh pine needles and a plastic glove laying on top of that bucket, because inevitably your jumper probably has a few mites on it, even if the nest is not overrun with it. So I always have that ready. I grab my bucket, I grab my glove, and I go get the jumper out of the yard as fast as I can, because a hawk is going to show up inevitably when it sees a bird on the ground. So that's the very first thing I do. Get him up, get him out of the yard, put him in the garage so he can start cooling off. And then I come in and I check my records. Obviously, you've already looked at the size and age of the nestling. You should know about how old he is. And then I start going through my records. I forgot to mention, notice where the nestling is in your yard if you have multiple racks. I have 3 racks, east, south, and west. And I always note where that jumper was when I first saw him, because he's likely from that rack. That's for people with multiple racks. And then I come in and I start looking at the closest 2 racks, and say, because they could have, flown a 10 feet, right, or so. And then I start trying to identify the nest and figure out what's my strategy for getting him back up there. What's the state of the colony right now? And does he look like really dehydrated? If he's really dehydrated and in poor shape, I'll probably make the choice to go ahead and feed him in an hour or 2 after he cools off. And I may even feed him overnight and then take him back out the next day when I determine which gourd he is supposed to go into. One day is not going to hurt unless he's the last one in the nest, maybe. But if the parents have 3 or 4 other birds in the nest that they're feeding, they're going to notice that one is missing. So you could keep him overnight, get him some food and rehydration, and take him back out the next morning if you've determined where he come from. Don't panic, but get him out of the yard.
Let me rephrase that for Kathy. Panic until you get him out of the yard.
Don't worry. Adrian is on that.
Yeah, I bet she is. Yeah, you're right, Brad, because inevitably a hawk will show up if they see one on the
Yeah,
ground.
it's pretty disappointing to come home from work in the afternoon and see a pile of feathers out in the middle of your yard where a jumper landed. And if you do this long enough, you're going to find that at some point in time.
Well,
And
and
you can-
5 minutes before this went down, yeah, she was out there clapping. So, yeah, we
Mhm.
were
Yeah,
like,
but-
"Are we going to log in on time?" Well, it doesn't matter. We're going to be here until we get it taken care of.
You got a house sparrow sitting on your gourd rack, Travis.
No, he doesn't.
So
Good.
Kelly
All
made
right.
a quick comment in the chat. He says people with S&K gourds can get the tunnel extensions to make the space bigger on the inside. I think I got mine for a few dollars each until I saved up for some Troyer gourds. Not sure what the price would be now, but it can buy you some time to upgrade at a later date without tossing your current setup. If you do buy the S&K gourds, be they Bow 9, Bow 11, etc., if you buy them straight from, for example, Tractor Supply store, they generally don't come with the tunnels. And if you do add the tunnels to the front, that can make them a little bit deeper. So that does make them a little bit better. And that can be an incremental improvement in your setup. So that's a good point, Kelly.
On those, can I ask a question? I'm sorry.
Sure.
On the houses, you talked about closing up the attic spaces. Would putting that expanding foam in there, would that not be better than that way hot air doesn't get in it to start with?
Well, in my mind, the best thing to do with those would be to glue a piece of
Oh.
screen over the hole so it gets some ventilation through it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are there
And
any other questions?
the only other thing I've got to say is that I faced the hottest weather this year that I ever remember facing during the biggest prime time of my colony fledging. And I can't say this for certain because I did all of them at one time, but I honestly think that all those gourd modifications that I did this winter is why I only had, and I say only 5 jumpers. 5 jumpers, when you got 100 pair colony or more, 5 jumpers is at least normal, if not less than normal. And I think it's just all these videos that we've done are great. And if you look at them, they all kind of connect in a big circle because one has an effect on the other. So keep your gourds, your nest dry, and you're not going to have Karen Darty, like Party, except with a D, has got her soldering iron ready. But yes, I really do. I'm so happy with well, I'm happy that I'm done and I don't ever have to do them again. But dry nests make life a lot easier for a Purple Martin landlord.
I have something to say. I don't say much. I'm really shy.
Oh, yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I
me
am.
too. Me too, Nancy.
Us shy people, I'll tell you, we got to stick together. I had probably the best season I could have. And it's only because of everything I have learned from watching you guys and attaining all the information that you guys have presented. I spent the off season, I built myself a bird room, a whole room in my basement, right off of my,
I remember.
yeah, right off my mom cave. And I spent the winter drilling and gluing and doing everything to all these gourds so that we did it right when spring came. And my husband and my husband has actually become my partner now in all of this. Originally, this was my hobby, but he is as much a partner in it as I am. But we have followed everything that we have learned from you guys. And we did, I actually did a little bit more. I know that you, Brad, had said that you do the 7 or the carbaryl once at pre-nesting, right?
Well, Yes and no. I used to. I didn't
Okay.
do that this year, and
Okay.
I won't do it anymore because I don't think it made any difference at all.
Well, I'll tell you what I did, and I think it made a huge difference. I did carbaryl at pre-nesting. Every nest was already inoculated, okay, before the birds had even arrived. Then once we had birds, and once they had laid eggs, and we had nests with eggs, I did another treatment, you know, 1/4 teaspoon in each nest, just to make sure, because I didn't know, you know, they were all different ages as far as, you know, the laying. And then, you know, the birds, we had, you know, hatchlings and then nestlings. And then about 2 weeks ago, David and I decided it was time to do a nest change because the nests were beginning to look a little ratty from all the uric acid and all the stuff that builds up. We did nest changes, and I put a little 1/4 teaspoon of the carbaryl in there. And we have not seen any mites. I mean, I literally have examined every time, and I do nest checks like every 2 to 3 days. And did not see any as far as the birds actually looked really, really good. You know, really, they were kind of progressing, and I was so proud, and I thought maybe we're doing something right here.
That's awesome.
Now, I was anticipating having jumpers because last year I did have jumpers, and it was rather interesting because my problem I've had since for the last 25 years, I've had a problem with my vision. So to be running around in the yard chasing what looks like one bird or what's supposed to be one bird and looks like 3, because I suffer from something called strabismus, which means I see double of everything. Well, I finally had the surgery done, so now I only see one of everything. So I was kind of looking forward to chasing just one bird. And I didn't have any jumpers this year. I mean, I was ready for them. I even went and bought a bird net so I could get them.
Awesome. Well,
But
thank you, Nancy.
It turned out to be a great season for us, and it's only because of everything I have learned from all of you people that have had the years and years of experience, good and bad.
Well,
So
great.
from my heart to yours, thank you so much.
Been our pleasure, really.
Yes, while I appreciate your comment and compliment, Nancy, all we can do is suggest things. You're the one that did it. We've suggested stuff to a lot of people for a long time, and some of them do it and some of them don't.
Yeah.
And we're proud for you because we love to see success.
Well, I guess I'm a bit of an overachiever. You know, I just try to do the best I can. I'm turning 70 on Saturday, and this is my hobby. It is my hobby until the day I draw my last breath.
Well, you are the mother of dragons. So
I am the mother of dragons, yes, and they all fledged, and not one of them breathed fire.
Oh, that's
Awesome.
disappointing.
Well, you guys have a great evening. Thank you again for a wonderful,
Thank you, Nancy.
evening. It's very, very informative.
Thank
I
you.
want to thank y'all too. I learned quite a bit this afternoon, and I had to farm. We don't quit at 6:30, so I had it on mute and no video for quite a bit. But I was listening in, and I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Debbie. Thank you for your participation. Kathy Lane, you had a question?
I had a couple of comments, if y'all don't mind. Well, first, what a great class this has been. Thank you all so much for doing this. Y'all do an excellent job, and I've learned a lot. And
They know y'all. Courtney does the Zoom. Courtney does all the stuff, the presentation stuff.
yeah, she does a great job putting all the pictures together. And
she lets me she lets me and Kathy, put her red check marks and stuff on it, but she's the one that
Right.
does all the work.
That's good. That's great to get several input from several people. But thank you all so much for having this and for letting the NCPMS people participate. I just had a couple of comments that I'd like to add in. We talked about misting gourds. I've not tried that yet, but I saw one of the pictures that had a water hose pulled up the pole and wrapped, I guess, to stop dripping and to secure it in place. But I would recommend figuring out some way to get water tubing or water hose inside your predator guard, or at least put netting around it, because that can be a nice route, a nice way for a snake to climb up that water hose. And if it's outside of the predator guard, there's nothing to stop him. So I just thought I would mention that. And we discussed changing out if you realize that your housing is not ideal. If you have a trio or one of the S&K houses that has small compartments and you want to change that, if you decide you want to go a different route and go with, for example, larger Toria horizontal gourds or Toria verticals, I've heard it recommended not to just take down your house and put a gourd rack up in its place, that sometimes the birds will be confused and may abandon and may not move in. And so what I think they recommend is to put a new unit nearby, close to your current housing, and let birds nest in both of those. Let them accept the new housing and nest in both units one season, and then you can take the old house down, or at least once birds are nesting in the new equipment, then you could remove the other equipment. So that's just a consideration. And the last thing I want to share is we've talked a lot about rehabbers. Courtney and I have been working with the Wildlife Center in Central Virginia. I live in Southern Virginia, but we have been trying to help them with some martins that had been brought to them. One landlord lost their housing in a storm, and they were elderly. They said, we can't repair this house, put it back up. We need help. We need kind of to know what to do. We need landlords that could foster in these babies. So I would just encourage people to try to find rehabbers in your state, and tell them to put you on a list that they could contact. And you could, if you do nest checks, you know how old your birds are and what size they are. And maybe they could send you photographs and say, all right, here's a bird with a ruler beside it. And I need nests that have babies this size. Do you have anything? This wildlife center said that they were able to deliver birds, which is great because they're several hours from me. So, but as it turned out, their permit only allows them to foster or release birds at colonies that are either in the county where they were rehabbed or the county where the birds came from. So that's really limiting. Unfortunately, the government puts these limits on them that they're in a different county than me, and those birds came from a totally different county. And so there was no way I could, if I had nests that were the same age, same size birds as their ones they needed to foster into, I couldn't have taken them because I didn't live in the right county. And so if we can help our rehabbers establish a database and say, hey, I'm willing to either for you to bring a flying bird here, a fledgling to release at my site, or I'm willing to foster babies in if I have nests that have babies the same size. I would just encourage people to find out who rehabbers are in their state and just tell them what county you live in and give them your contact information and tell them you're available to help answer questions if they need help, and that you'd be willing to see what you have, or willing for them to come and release birds if you still have birds at your site when they have birds that they need to get into a colony.
That's great information.
That was
Thank you
all.
for sharing that, Kathy.
You're welcome.
I had no
Thank you.
idea that they had those kind of restrictions on some of the rehabbers.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And every rehabber may be different. Their permits may be different. Some may be permitted to release birds in any county, but some it's their strict requirements on what they can do. And I think that's really sad, because I understand the principle. We're not wanting to relocate wildlife in totally different areas, but when you got something as specific as it needing to go into a martin colony, not just into somebody's backyard,
Right.
that makes it really difficult.
Sure.
Also, if you know of a roost, tell your rehabbers where that is too, because like all my birds have fledged now. So that even if they said, we've got a bird from Halifax County, can we come and release it at your site? There's no birds here anymore. Everybody's already left and gone to roosts. But if I knew of any roost around here, I could say, point them to where to go and tell them what time to go and release it. But I'm not aware of any in my area, but maybe y'all know of some, and that would be helpful information for them. I'm also going to find out, I suggested that they get the PMCA's laminated baby photos to be able to know exactly what age their birds are. And that way, for landlords that have those, they know exactly what they've got, and wouldn't have to swap pictures back and forth. They could just say, I've got a 23-year-old baby. Do you have a nest that's got those babies that age? And if they haven't bought them yet, I want to donate a set or donate money to them to buy them, just to try to help them out and make it easier for them and easier for the landlords that might help them.
That's a great point. Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up too about the laminated photos. For some strange reason, I went 18 of my 19 years as a purple martin landlord without a set of those. And after getting a set this spring, I thought, why in the world did I wait? It's like the most useful thing I've ever had. It's as handy as a hand wrench on your gourd rack. And I'm thinking, golly, how stupid I am. So.
Okay, folks. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a great discussion and good to see everybody here. It is getting late for us here on the East Coast, so I think we're going to wrap it up for the evening.
Dude, it's getting late for us here in the Central Time Zone. Bedtime.
All right, everybody have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.